Hi, everybody, and welcome to another episode of the AI Basecamp Podcast. Today, we're going to talk about how to keep your AI project on track. Turns out, stat I read recently is that 80% of all AI projects fail, meaning negative return on investment, which is twice as much as the average software project. It was a study done 10 years ago and also shown in the Harvard Business Review that showed 40% of all software projects actually have a negative ROI across companies in North America. And with AI projects, as of late, the number is nearly double, which is obviously not something that you like to hear as business owner or as anyone responsible for this in the business. And to discuss, I am as often joined by our head of AI at K2, Aleksander Obuchowski. Alex, a few words from your end about today's episode.
Yeah, so as Jonas said, we want to really address the downfalls of AI projects in this episode because, as it turns out, a lot of them fail, and it's not it's not usually because of the tech itself or because the algorithm is not good enough, the model is not accurate enough. It's because of the business decision made before, during, or after execution of the project. And this is something that is really important because AI developers, we are expensive, so you don't want to waste your resources, your money on AI model that you're never gonna adopt and that's not gonna bring a concrete business values. So that's what we're gonna talk today about how to truly take advantage of the AI project and make sure that they are bringing value for your company.
How to generate value for your business concretely. And we are going to be covering this topic of how to keep your project on track in 5 steps. We're going to talk about selection of the underlying technology, which actually doesn't always have to be AI. But obviously, we are then going to be discussing the AI part. Then we're going to talk about the development, which is the second out of 5. We will talk about evaluation as the third one. Then about adoption, because even if you have developed something and it does work well, it still needs to be adopted across your organization to generate positive ROI, return on investment. And then, as final point, the management, the ongoing maintenance and management of your solution. All those 5, in our opinion, are crucial to get right if you want your AI project to be a success. And without further ado, let's jump into the first bit, the selection of a technical solution for whichever business problem it is that you're facing. And just to start from the big picture and in general terms, what you need to consider are always at least 3 things. The strategic alignment between the people who will actually be building the solution and the people who understand the business. Often, and I'm jumping a bit ahead now, but just to give context, what happens is that the people building or the teams building, you selected an AI solution for some problem, don't fully understand what matters most, and there's a mismatch or lack of communication between the business side and the development side. So those need to be strategically aligned. You need to be able to measure the impact, especially if you want any sort of AI model in the process. If you can't measure the impact properly, you might as well not do it. And often measuring is difficult. So that's something to just consider early on when you select whether using AI is best. And you also should try to, as early as you can, because it's important to estimate ROI and your metrics, consider whether it's an augmentation or a replacement problem of human capital. And what I mean by that is whether your AI solution will need or will require a human in the loop or not. And usually the way to answer that question is to consider the cost of getting something wrong, the cost of error. If the cost of error is really high, then you will need a human in the loop. For example, say a doctor diagnosis, if you have an AI system to support the interpretation of an X-ray scan of some kidney images, for example, say not cancer detection, for example, then you don't want replacement, you want augmentation. But if it's about suggesting the best product for someone to buy or the you might know as well, person on, say, LinkedIn or Facebook, then the cost of getting something that the user doesn't want to buy or a person that the user doesn't know is not very high. So here we don't need augmentation, we need replacement. Alex, if you want, you can maybe go into some further examples here, or maybe I was rushing ahead a bit in the selection stage, so the first stage.
Yeah. So I definitely want
how
to.
do you decide even whether to use AI or no?
Yeah. So it's not really a simple thing because as the points that you outlined. So first one is strategic alignment. So you have to think about, is it really helping the core business or your core product? Because I have an example project that I was doing when it's actually a different case when the side project was not AI based, but still the same principles apply here. So we were developing an AI algorithm and we needed a labeling solution. And right then there were no labeling solution provided for medical images. So we decided to build our own. And in the end, we thought that this is a good product. Maybe we should pursue it further, spend some more time developing it, some more money, and maybe we can sell it to others and market it as a product. But in the end, because it was so far for like our core business, so we wanted to do AI-based diagnostics and make AI models, not software development product. It didn't really succeed in the end, although the tech was quite cool, but it was far away from our main strategic goal. So we have to look at the processes that really help you with that do not deviate that much from your core product. And another example, like sort of good practice that you can do here, and we actually did it for one project, was to maybe help the AI developers, ML engineers be aligned with the core product by shadowing some of the work that your, for example, regular employees do. So we did it at the one project. One day we went to the company headquarters, work alongside editors for a day. And then we saw what are the bottlenecks if the processes. We understood the process better. We immediately had some concrete ideas about how AI could solve them. But if we were to do it otherwise, like talk to stakeholders only, talk to managers, we probably wouldn't get the same insight and we wouldn't be able to understand the product that good. So it's a good thing to, follow the process. And for example, I also know that Netflix is, for example, mostly optimizing one metric, that is user churn, and they want to minimize it. So each project that they take, each product or sub-service that they want to develop needs to help this one specific goal, minimize user churn. And that's sort of good way to thinking about AI projects. So does it help your one single metric that you care most about? Is it like the cost? Is it efficiency? Is it, for example, expanding you to new markets, new clients? But you have to think about the core product.
Completely agreed. And I think a great example is also, for example, for this strategic alignment point. What I've seen some companies, it's probably more difficult in today's world, but what I've seen some companies do successfully is to physically bring development and whichever sort of execution team it is in the case close together. So to have them interact over lunch, maybe even sit in the same room, to shorten communication paths sufficiently that the feedback loops become really fast.
And it's obviously harder in a remote work environment, because you don't have this lunch breaks, you don't have coffee breaks together, you can't really chat. So it's really hard thing to do, and you can, for example, set up regular meetings, but then again, you don't want to overburden your developers with the meetings.
Yeah, but especially in remote companies, you need to be aware of the risk of strategic misalignment. That the guys who are using it are not talking to each other sufficiently. Maybe as a last point, but I think also very important when talking about selection of the correct solution, a technological solution for the problem, is a conversation I had with the CTO at Media Press Group, Rafael Fagas, who said, if you can solve a problem without the use of AI, do it. Only use AI if you really have to, because it does make mistakes. And if there's something old school, maybe less sexy, not so much in fitting into the hype right now, but a solidly working solution, use that instead. Always consider whether you really have to use AI, and otherwise don't, because these models are designed to, well, they will always have inherently some level of error in whichever task they do. But of course,
Yeah, exactly. And what you talked about previously, like augment or replace. Obviously, if you can, you want to AI model to augment the work, not replace the work, because then it's the risks are too high. For example, to model to be fully autonomous, but for example, it can help the human workers with some specific narrow parts of the job.
Unless it is a task where the cost of error is very low, like suggesting a product to buy, for example. Let's maybe move on
exactly.
to the next point. Unless, Alex, something else on this?
Yeah, one more remark very quickly. Like, you also need to consider data availability when talking about the project, because, for example, a lot of people have great ideas about how AI can incorporate to their companies, but they don't have the data. And later, when they start the project, they develop some POC even. They see that the project doesn't scale because it would need much more data to be accurate. So really think about the kind of data you have, the kind of data you can easily obtain, because for example it's open or you can buy it, but definitely it has to impact your decision in the end, whether or not to use AI for a specific project. Because for example, AI and in general deep learning is strives only when there is like a high volume of data. So if the data is low, maybe choose simple algorithms such as rule-based system, such as decision trees, linear regression, basic like ML. But if you have a lot of data, only then should you consider essentially deep learning. And the rule of thumb is to have at least dozens of or hundreds of examples per single case when doing classification for the system to be truly accurate.
Very important to add that. If we talk about the second stage, the development, so if I want to keep my project on track, I need to select correctly, I need to develop in a suitable way. What would you say is most important in that stage? It's a huge topic, I know. We have to condense it for the time being.
Yeah, it's quite. This problem appears quite often. For example, when I talk to some companies or I join new teams, I see that they don't usually have a great workflow for developing the AI models, because with regular software development is different. You can do agile, you can just bring small functionalities. It's really, you can see some basic improvements and iterations really quickly, but the AI project has to be planned from the start to finish, essentially, because there is no value in getting 80% there or something like that. So this process needs to be really structured. And for example, what I also saw, that some companies, when they are doing AI research, they say like, we have 90% accuracy, but it was on some data set from 2 years ago and nobody can find the data set or even, make the results again on the same model, etc. So there are a few like concrete examples of tools that you can use to sort of orchestrate or monitor the process. Firstly, the data. You can use tools like data version control, DVC for short, to control versions of the dataset, because this process is constantly improving. So with new data, you have new model. So it's sort of iterative cycle. So you have to keep track of your data. When you are developing ML models, you also need to keep track of the results the model are getting on what data, what architectures, what parameters. And there are a few great ways to track those models. For example, weights and biases is one service like that, I think the most popular. There are even open source alternatives such as MLflow and some smaller companies like Neptune AI. And what they do is they do AI model management or AI experiment management, let's say, with tracking different models. Then the third step is, once you are happy with the results, everything is great, bringing the model to production. And it's also a stage where many companies fail because they the integration is really hard. And you actually also have to think at the integration on the planning stage. So if
let's maybe Alex, before jumping from development to production, deployment, adoption, briefly also talk about the that we listed here as third, which is the like evaluation stage, which of course needs to come between or during development. You will need it. It will have to be a sort of looped process. But the important things, I guess, to consider if we talk generally speaking when evaluating the current AI solution, the AI model that you're building for whichever problem you have, is A/B test, classical one. So you compare the new solution to the prior case and keep doing so as you iterate. Then also, and I guess that's something that's a bit more tricky to evaluate, you need to try and identify risks that could lead to your data set that you were training with not encapsulating the whole reality of the deployed cases. Like a classical example here could be if you build a forecasting model and let's say sales forecasting, or you're somehow dealing with sales and historic sales data, that those are also subject to external market impulses, sudden market shift. We can think about global pandemic happening or high inflation that might have been the result of that. Those things, obviously, the model will struggle with when just being trained on historic data. But what you can do in the evaluation stage is A/B testing and try as much as possible to analyze for risks or potential scenarios that could lead to this thing. And then later on in the management stage, we're going to talk about continuous monitoring also.
Yeah, actually, it's also good to maybe come back for a little bit to the previous stage, because when choosing a project, you also have to keep in mind, is this solution easily comparable to our previous workflow? So obviously, it's a case for choosing a project if it can be easily comparable. So you have to keep that in mind. And about the data, like you said, the data can also be not great, and there can be some biases. Maybe in the next episode we can talk about concrete tools to find bias in your data, because it's also super important.
Actually, not just with a potential sudden shift, but intrinsically, internally. I think we all had multiple examples recently in the news. Gemini creating historically inaccurate imagery and so on and so forth.
Yeah, exactly. So we can talk about specific tools that you can use to minimize it. So stay tuned for the further episodes. But right now, like even doing a sanity check, because obviously you're probably not training foundational models, so your problem is more narrow. So you can just do some simple statistical analysis, like distribution of certain classes, certain aspects, to quickly make sure your model isn't biased. For example, there was a case, I don't remember the company name, but it was AI model for recruitment. And it turns out the model was biased towards men. And it was because in the historical settings, the recruiters were biased towards men and were more keen on hiring men. And it's not the model fault, because model can be as accurate as the data you give it. So you can just, it would be a simple check at the beginning of training to make sure, like you don't have a distribution when 90% of the higher candidates are men and 10% are women, and you don't want to train a model on stuff like that.
Yeah, you are highlighting a really important point here, which is that evaluation shouldn't just begin with model performance, but needs to begin with data quality. Right? Like,
yeah, exactly.
Both of those are extremely, extremely important.
And for the evaluation, just a brief point there. It's not good enough because the usual workflow is to set aside like training data set, then test data set, then some people, it's a good practice, also do development data set when the model is fine-tuned and you tune the model on the development side, and that the test data set is just lying there and is used at the end of the evaluation to make sure you're not, optimizing the model towards specific data set. But usually it's also not enough, because the data can shift and you only have one specific benchmark. So what you can do easily is, for example, k-fold validation, where you split the data set 5 times into training and test parts, and each iteration, the 20% of the data is reserved for testing, 80% is reserved for training, and then you can really mitigate any sort of distribution shift between the different splits, because the model goes through every possible combination. So if for example, the testing dataset, it's easier in one iteration, it will be much harder in different iteration. So it's sort of a process that makes sure you didn't choose the test dataset wrong.
Payful validation, yeah, definitely very, very powerful method here. So then when we have the evaluation stage covered and you consider and do it properly, we move on to a really, really important stage 4, adoption stage. And I'd claim that a lot of projects until then, the motivation is there, development teams do their thing, they see that it actually, like in the evaluation stage, that the model performs really well. The metrics that you defined initially are working in your favor. And you already consider the project a success, but then it fails. And why does it fail? Because it's not embraced by the employees and the company. And this is it goes back to the point of strategic alignment that we had at the start, but also it cannot be stressed enough the importance of this adoption stage 4 in a company. You have a well-working model, but you need to get employees in the places where you designed the model for to use it as well. And it needs to be adopted on a wide scale across the corporation. And there's an interesting approach to this. So to try to narrow it down. AI products having 3 pillars: the algorithm itself, the developer, and the process. And as soon as the employees mistrust one of those 3 pillars, you're not gonna achieve the adoption you want. If for some reason they think the algorithm, they saw it make a mistake, so they completely don't trust its merit anymore, even though, of course, we all know AI algorithms inherently do make errors, they do make mistakes. But if an employee sees that too often and mistrusts the algorithm, you kind of lost already. If for some reason they mistrust the developers, we talked about this earlier, but sometimes it can be perceived by the normal employees, the developers, they're trying to build models to make them redundant. So there you immediately get a level of distrust in the developer, which then also automatically leads to like a rejection attitude towards whatever they're producing. And the whole process, if there's an impression on the normal employee that the guys building or managing this new solution don't understand what's important in the workflow and mistrust their knowledge of the process, you also will struggle really, really, really much with adopting the solution. So all those 3 need to be correct, and adoption should never be underestimated, I think. Maybe Alex, you can enrich with some.
Yeah, because I think it's not only about adoption, because I agree with what you said. Like, this stage is where the cliff happens. So most of the AI projects, they have good accuracy, the developers are happy with the results, or the KPIs that you set initially are fulfilled, but then in the end, the product is not incorporated. The AI model is not incorporated in the end product. And adoption is, of course, one major part of that, but there are also other things to consider, like, for example, the execution time of a model. Because, for example, you can have a model that is really accurate.
Like, adoption can fail because it's not easy to use, or too slow.
Yeah, like, for example, you think that model has a high accuracy, but it takes, 300 milliseconds to process the data. And then once you try to integrate it, the development department actually tells you that, by the way, we need 20 milliseconds, otherwise it doesn't make sense. So you have to set up those things at the beginning, because it also influences the model that you selected. And then, for example, you can... Why the project fails? Because you see that reducing the time from 30 milliseconds to 20 milliseconds essentially is too costly and requires redoing the project all again with different technologies. So you've wasted pretty much a few months of development on that. So execution time, simple stuff, but also quite important. Also, in general, you have to think if at the start of the project, you have to think if the development team can consume the project, meaning integrate it into the product, because it's not only about execution times, but sometimes incorporating this AI model would make drastical changes to the code base, and maybe there is some legacy code in that, maybe some stuff is hard-coded, maybe it's not super modular, it's not easy to swap certain steps, and the stakeholders can make a decision like, okay, we have this AI project, AI model, but to incorporate it, we will need to spend 3 months on development, and we can't really do that because we need to work on features for clients. And that's also the stuff I've seen personally, and also is a like major downfall of AI-based projects. And coming back maybe to the people themselves, like you really have to also explain them how to use this data. If you are developing as an in-house tool for your own app or as an app for your customers, you in both of those groups you need to do some education and explain how to use the AI model, especially if the AI model is advanced. So for example, we have this project when we're doing computer-based diagnosis for kidney tumor malignancy prediction. The goal was to upload a CT scan, and the model said if the kidney tumor is malignant or benign. And we saw some bias from the doctors because, for example, they uploaded image of a lung or some other organ, and the model still gave prediction. And they were like, how can this be accurate if I throw a random data at it and it gives me wrong prediction? But it's not what the model was trained for. So in this case, like clear conversation and explaining like this model does one specific thing, you can't use it for another thing. You have to sort of narrow the data that you feed to it for it to make sense. Really helped. And you also have to think about stuff like that. You have to explain how the user, internal or external, can have the most value out of the tools and what are the constraints and the prerequisites that they need to follow.
Yeah, so that you need to think of it, but exactly like you said, you need educational material and you need to make sure the user also understands this early on and not just someone into the process when they see it make some unexpected or useless or erroneous behavior that makes the user lose trust in it, because that's when you're really going to struggle to get the adoption. In essence, most AI models, pretty much all of them exhibit this characteristic, are black boxes to some extent. And it's very difficult for a human being to trust a black box for good reason. But that's what you need for successfully mastering this adoption stage. Should we maybe move on to the final? Okay, one more point on this.
Yeah, one more point about the black box, because it's also something that you have to think about for sure. And also you can think about incorporating explainable AI into the workflow to maybe understand how the process works, but also explain the users how it works. And there is a famous case of AI model that was trained to classify the severity of a case based on X-rays. And it was super accurate, but then they did some explainable AI algorithm on it and to highlight what part of the image the model is looking at. And the model was looking at letter L that was on the CT scan and only on that, not on the chest, not on the body itself. And it was because patients that were lying down, they couldn't stand up for the X-ray, had this letter L to indicate the X-ray was in lying position on bed. And the model only looked at that. And obviously, if the patient can't even stand up for the X-ray, they are in bad condition. So the model was useless because it was trained on this wrong data set with annotations already there that they can look at. And this is kind of stuff that it will be really hard to catch otherwise, if not for using explainable AI algorithm to highlight the decision process of the black box AI model.
Yeah, because like here, maybe to just provide a bit of background for some listeners, the black box applies really on two levels. On one level, it's the normal end user who gets an aid in their daily task, and for them it's a black box. It's a machine that they throw say we stay in the same example domain, throw the image in and get some recommendation out. But it also exists on the other level where the developer themselves have to admit yeah, to me, it's also a black box. This deep neural net, it has loads of weights and layers and nodes, and it's impossible for me to say what exactly, like what's exactly happening there. But for this second layer, explainable AI, the concept of explainable AI tries to at least shed some light on the black box for a developer who can then understand, okay, these features from the initial image are important for the decision, and this other half of the image actually doesn't matter. Whichever it shows, it doesn't really affect the final outcome of what the model predicts to see or classify in this image. Yeah, no, a very important point. Let's move on to the final one. We're already at the half-hour mark. Then we should probably wrap things up soon. But the last very important step, the fifth step in making an AI project successful, is the management stage, or the continuous monitoring and management, if you so will. And here, I think, again, we can differentiate between three different reasons for why it's important. Number one, you want your model to improve. And as people use it, you gather more data, you see what works well and what doesn't, and you can incrementally improve. Number two, you can, I guess it plays into the improvement part also, but you can get more people and even more widespread adoption. But then, very importantly also, you can respond if for some reason performance drops. And this happens whenever there's some big change that wasn't captured in the training data. So maybe we can enrich an example and say an AI predicting customer purchasing behavior for an online clothing retailer. Now, the fashion is obviously, as we all know, it runs in waves and it changes month to month even. If there is a new fashion trend that wasn't captured in the data, obviously the model will require retraining if you don't want performance drops. So for all these reasons, management and continuous monitoring is key if you want your project in AI to be successful in the long term.
Yeah, one interesting thing that you also need to, right now, it's especially important, you have to take into account that if you're using models developed by others that are available through API, not in your internal infrastructure, you also have to account not only for the dataset changing or the distribution changing, but also for the model changing, because they can update the model and it can drastically change the results. Actually, I had a conversation just today about AI implementation that we did, and the users started to complain that the model is behaving worse. And they were like, did you change anything? And we were like, no, we didn't change anything. And it appeared that because the different versions of, ChatGPT changed, it wasn't able to do one specific task that it was able to do before. So continuous monitoring is super important. Also monitor, the type of data you process. You can later cluster them to identify specific new use cases. You can do analysis on them, but even as simple as measuring how much the data that the generative model produces is actually used. And you can quickly see that something is wrong if this number drops significantly, or how much, the predictions are make it to the end product, or users agree with the prediction, if they accept the prediction, especially if it's like a human assisted model diagnosis. If they click like, I like the prediction, I accept the prediction, measure how often people do that, because it can also drastically vary between different times.
Yeah, and you can use the user feedback to not just catch performance drops, but continuously improve these models.
Yeah, exactly.
All right. I think so. So maybe just to quickly summarize and then bring it to a close. We now heard this shocking statistic again. 80%, roughly, nearly 80% of all machine learning projects have a negative ROI. You don't want to be part of those 80%, and obviously, like, sometimes things might happen, but the important bits to try and be in the 20%. And maybe even increase this number over time, is to, in all these 5 stages, from selection, do you even need AI, or is there something old school that is more reliable, to development, evaluation, adoption, I cannot stress it enough, and then continuous management and monitoring. You need to be alert, on track, think about strategic alignment between the guys doing it and the guys using it. Open communication, as always, remains super important. Data needs to be in every AI conversation. Do we have the chance to find metrics and actually measure the success of it? Because otherwise it's super risky. You probably shouldn't start. And the last point you made, do we need to rely on outside APIs, models, foundation models that can change and we have no control over? Or is this project important to us and long enough and feasible because we have the technical capability to do it in-house and maintain full control? Like, all these questions need to be carefully considered and discussed, and then you set yourself up best for being part of the 20% and not the 80% who have negative ROIs.
Yeah, exactly.
I think we leave it there. We're over time, 35 minutes, but I hope it was enjoyable for everybody. Thanks, Alex, and thanks to the viewers. Great session as always. See you in the next one, and thanks for tuning in.
Thank you, and see you in 2 weeks.
See you, everybody.
Thank you for listening to AI Basecamp Podcast. If you need help implementing AI solutions, go to K2AI and book a free consultation today.